Now I am thrilled to introduce our next speakers who will share their wisdom about the all-important youth vote. Della Volpe, who is the director of polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics and the author of Fight, How Gen Z is channeling their fear and passion to save America. Della Volpe is considered by many to be the leading authority on the youth vote. Ethan Jasny from the class of 25 is the student chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project. Our CGB intern, Madison Egan, class of 25, will moderate a Q&A following this presentation. So please put your questions in the chat as we go along. Welcome, John and Ethan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. It is great to be with everybody. Ethan and I are going to spend a few minutes with you, and I want to talk about three things, and then Ethan is going to talk about some of the latest work our students have published this year. I want to talk to you about three things. The first thing I want to talk to you about is how I define the youth vote, and what their experience has been as young adults as they enter the electorate. One. Second is I'm going to talk to you quickly about the impact they've already made, and then I'll give you an overview of where their mood is today heading into 2024. So when I think about the youth vote, I'm generally talking about 18 to 29-year-olds. I'm talking about it's roughly that's roughly half of this cohort is Gen Z, and the other half of this cohort, the folks in their late 20s, are millennials. When you combine Gen Z with millennials, who go all the way up to age 42, we have roughly 40% of the electorate. Okay, roughly 40% of the electorate, and I think the real difference is when we think about working or thinking about reaching out to a millennial voter versus a Gen Z or Zoomer voter. The big difference, I think, is that this millennial has a living memory and experience of 9/11 and also 9/12 and 9/13, when Americans, regardless of what county we lived in, a red or a blue county, we all found a flag, put it on our front door, and we felt united as a country. Gen Z, Zoomers, Ethan, Madison, and other members of the undergraduate class and tens of millions of people across the country, members of Gen Z, have never had that experience. They don't remember a time when America was truly united. In fact, over the last 15 years, it's been, I would argue, the greatest level of stress and chaos that America has seen since at least the greatest generation with this age. All of this before this generation is even mature, their brain is mature, according to neuroscience. It's just a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, a lot of division, which really impacts their mental health. But despite that, they've had a tremendous impact on shaping the country already. Without younger people, in 2018, 2020, and 2022, it's a very different country. And in each of those three elections, specifically the last two elections, we found that members of my generation, which is Gen X and baby boomers and the silent generation, they overwhelmingly supported Republicans and Donald Trump. It is because of the turnouts and the preference for Democrats of millennials and specifically Gen Z that President Biden's in office, that Schumer is in charge of the Senate. We have our first African-American female in the Supreme Court, the largest climate action in our history, the first bipartisan gun violence prevention in a couple generations, $127 billion in student debt, all because of young people. We think so much about this country being divided 50-50, and of course it is. I think it's more accurate to think about the divisions based upon age. Roughly 2/3 of millennials and Gen Z have a set of values that comport neatly with progressive values and the values of the Democratic Party, whereas older generations' values are more aligned with conservatives and Republicans to date. That's the way the elections have been happening, both on a national basis as well as in most of the states over the last few cycles. So that's just a quick bit of history. Before I hand it off to Ethan in a moment, I want to talk about their mood today because it's different. As I said, young people, they've had record turnout in 18, in 20, and close to record turnout in 22. More young people voted, more members of Gen Z voted than members of every other generation when they were that age, one. But the early signs from our Harvard IOP youth polling are quite concerning for me. The numbers that I track to get an early sense of what the electorate might look like are quite a bit different than they were 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we saw an enthusiasm about engagement, though concern about the direction of the country. We saw high levels of interest in following the news, engaging in politics, indicating that they're voting, believing that politics could make a difference. Each of those measures has declined in a significant and negative way over the last 4 years. Today, relative to 4 years ago, we find cynicism has increased by double digits. We see the number of young people who say they're likely to vote has decreased by a significant margin as well. And association with the Democratic Party has also decreased in significant ways. The most concerning number, and you've seen this and read about this, I think, in other media, perhaps, is that among young African American and Blacks, 64% 4 years ago identify with the Democratic Party. Today, it's 49%. 15, 16-point difference in only 4 years. Young Hispanic men and women have a similar trend, although they're less likely to go from Democrat to independent, like young Blacks. They're more likely to go from Democrat to Republicans. It's a combination of things. It's a combination of things, I think, centered on a lack of information for a variety of reasons, not following the news, not aware of the many accomplishments of the Biden administration. So what I believe over the course of the next year, it's incumbent to do basically two things. One is to encourage young people, to remind young people that we have a different country today because of them, and they need to continue to stay involved in the process, that government can and does do big things. With overview of some of the messages I've just talked about. And then second, as the campaign draws closer, we'll clearly see the significant differences between Biden and likely Trump as a nominee. We also have to be very concerned, of course, about independent candidacies as well, specifically Cornel West and Bobby Kennedy, who have a significant amount of support among young people. Quinnipiac poll last week indicated they have 40% between the two of them. So that is, despite like the incredible job that organizers did last night across the country, school board races, governor's races, state senate, we do want to, I think, just kind of talk about the reality that we're seeing here so we can head into 24, understanding the work that is ahead of us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan, who's led our project for the last couple of semesters, and he's going to share some data points from the last survey that we released last spring. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, John. So yeah, I'm just going to talk about some of our recent numbers from our poll. As John and Janet were sort of talking about, I lead a project at Harvard College where we every semester do a poll of young Americans, and so these are some of our sort of important recent findings. Just to put some numbers to what John was talking about. So I'm going to start with talking about the bad news, which is sort of what John was talking about there. If you're a Democrat. So the first and the main thing is that Joe Biden is unpopular. And this is something if you've been following the polling, but we had Biden's approval down to 36% last spring, and that often trails the top line numbers for Biden's approval among Americans as a whole. So Biden is unpopular, but one important thing to note here is that if you look at young people who say that they closely follow the news, Biden's approval is around 10 points higher. So the point is that for people who are, paying attention, who know, what's going on or following the accomplishments of the Biden administration, that approval is higher. The question is, how do you bridge that engagement gap to see the work that Biden is doing? Second piece of bad news for Democrats, this is sort of what John was talking about, which is that you see the number of Black and Hispanic young people who identify as Democrats and who say they're likely to vote in 2024 as decreasing. So just over the span of 4 years, you see a 15-point drop in Black young people identifying as Democrats, and an 8-point drop in Black young people saying that they're definitely going to be voting. For Hispanics, it's a 6-point drop in Democrats and 9-point drop in definitely voting. So that doesn't mean that these people are going to go around and vote for Trump in 2024. I think that the more likely outcome is that people just stay home because they aren't inspired by Biden, or they don't see Trump as great as a threat as he was. So that's, those are the, I think, concerning numbers to look at, particularly young Black and Hispanic people not turning out to vote. And that's why it's so important, that the youth organization efforts we've seen, last night and throughout the past, few years continue strong. The good news for Democrats, though, is that, as a whole, our generation seems to be more progressive than previous generations, and there's some evidence that has some sticking power. So one interesting thing we did last semester is we looked at comparing, the political identification of people who came from conservative households and those who came from liberal households. And what we found is that, fewer than half of people who say they, grew up in conservative households call themselves Republicans. So you see people who grew up in conservative families, becoming Democrats or at least becoming independents, whereas those who grew up in liberal households, are staying more Democratic. And to back that up as well, what we've seen as well is over the past decade, we've tracked a bunch of basic typology questions. So I know there's a lot going on in this slide, but on things like, the government should provide basic health care, the government should spend more to reduce poverty, the government should, climate change is an issue and the government should do things to address it, even at the expense of climate growth. Like, agreement with those types of ideas have increased by, in some cases, as much as 20 percentage points just over the last 10 years. So the point is that, young people are increasingly more progressive under the hood, supporting basic liberal democratic ideas, even if they, there's some malaise about identifying with the party, particularly for young Black and Hispanic voters. Okay, and then briefly, I want to talk about a couple more interesting findings from our poll that I just think are important for understanding our generation. One thing relates to gun violence. So more than 1 in 3 young Americans are concerned about themselves or someone close to them being a victim of gun violence. And you also see roughly half of female college students are concerned about being the victim of a mass shooting or being a victim of sexual assault. So I think there's a real fear among our generation, around gun violence and around public safety in general. Another really sort of surprising finding from last semester as well is that around 1 in 3 young Americans personally believe that one day they could become homeless, and 73% of young Americans believe that homelessness can happen to anyone. And I think those numbers are just really startling. And so, we often talk about the economy in broad terms, but for young people on the ground, there is real, concern and anxiety that people have around their financial situation, about their safety with regards to mass shootings. And I think, those issues being addressed is really important in terms of, improving engagement and just outlook among young people. And then the final thing to talk about is, for the past couple semesters, we've been asking questions related to mental health. And the number, we sort of started doing this during the pandemic, sort of see if, during the pandemic, there were concerns around mental health. But surprisingly and concerningly, those numbers have stayed consistent. And so what we found consistently is that around half of young Americans under 30 report feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, or at least several days in the last 2 weeks. And around 20 to 25% say they've had thoughts that they'd be better off dead, or thoughts of hurting themselves in some way, at least several times in the past 2 weeks, 20%. So those numbers are really important as well. And I think real evidence that there's a mental health crisis among our generation. So, the point overall is, young Americans remain a really important vote, for 2024 and upcoming elections, but there are also, really real concerns that young people are facing every day. And at the very least, being aware of those and, hopefully doing things to address those anxieties and concerns will really be important going forward.